In this video, I'll be going over my honest thoughts on the Chapter 2 changes, what I might still want to see, what I think might need some adjustment, and my overall thoughts on the state of Chapter 2. In my opinion, Chapter 2 brought a ground-shaking amount of foundational changes to the way that we play Ascension in Season 9, reinvigorating the Manastorm to not only be a viable mode for rolling scrolls, but a completely and utterly enjoyable mode that any player has easy access to for the purposes of gearing and character progression. This is fantastic for people who do not have the time to dedicate to a traditional MMO and find it difficult to form raid groups and even at times Mythic Plus groups, depending on the time that they have to dedicate to the game. First, we have the new passive and active Manastorm affixes. On paper, I find these to be really great and flavorful changes that broadly increase the enjoyability of the Manastorm. The new on-death affixes that feel like they help the player just as much as they help the enemy are particularly enjoyable to me. I enjoy the increased damage field that can drop on death, increasing both player and mob damage by 50%. I also enjoy the frozen orb on death effect because its radius is so low that it feels like if the player is being hit by it, it is actually their fault. This means that in standard gameplay loop, a mob with the frozen orb effectively is actually a boon to your clear, as you can focus it down first in the pack and have the frozen orb radius kill the rest of the pack for you if you are struggling with AoE clear, as the damage it does to mobs is actually incredibly significant, and it's pretty easy to have them stand in it too. The catharsis that is provided by things that used to be purely annoying, like Bone Storm, is simply fantastic. I find that a lot of the time when I'm running Manastorm, I can position myself in a way that the Bone Storm, while tracking me, actually runs through all of the mobs that I'm fighting. Sometimes even raid bosses lose very solid amounts of health because this does a lot of damage to mobs. Almost everything that used to be annoying in Chapter 1, Manastorm has been improved. However, in my opinion, the one sore spot that I still find is the lightning rod on death affix. With the Chapter 2 release notes, it was stated that affixes would show up far less often in higher Manastorm levels, their frequency being reduced and their power being sharply increased instead by the affix rank system. To my mind, I thought this meant that things like lightning rod would become far less oppressive in tight spaces, as there would be less lightning on the ground for you to run into, but if you did run into it, you would suffer massively increased damage compared to the past. This, however, has not been the case in my experience. I find that in the 400s range of Manastorms, when I kill a singular mob with the lightning rod affix, my screen is filled with almost countless lightning pillars and further storm strikes that were added with the introduction of affix ranks, making the death of just one of these mobs equate to what would have been 3, 4, maybe even 5 mobs with the lightning affix in Chapter 1. I thought that the purpose of the affix ranks was to reduce ground clutter, but it actually made ground clutter more punishing. I'd like to see this improved in the future of Chapter 2. Other than that, my only chief complaint in the Manastorms department is that the reflect affix is anti-fun and not engaging for people to interact with. There's several posts with almost 100% support from the player base that agree that the reflective affix does not really add to Manastorms, and I'm sure the devs have seen these posts, but I wanted to point it out as well because I find that in its current state, it's not enjoyable, and it kind of feels like slamming into a brick wall at 100 miles per hour. When you go from decimating the mobs you encounter because you worked so hard on your build, spending thousands of scrolls and grinding the gear to perfect it, only to one-shot yourself in less than a second because a full mob pack with reflective procced. The change I propose, because I don't like just complaining, but offering solutions, is to have the reflect affix be changed to store a percentage of the damage that you deal to the mob over the 5 seconds that it's active. After the buff expires, have a cone effect in front of the mob or in a direction that is facing you when the effect ends. It deals the stored damage after 1 or 2 seconds, giving you time to react to the return cone and meaningfully and satisfyingly dodge if you are being mindful of your positioning during combat. In my opinion, this changes a otherwise brutally punishing and uninteractive affix into one that can be played around and almost completely ignored if it is given consideration by the player. You can still be killed by this affix, but this way it feels much more like a player mistake than a direct punishment from the Manastorm gods. My only other critique of Manastorm in Chapter 2 is that there's too little of a really fantastic thing, that being the Manastorm original levels. Now you guys obviously put a lot of effort into these maps. They're gorgeous. They use really high quality models and textures that pull straight from some of the best artwork that WoW has to offer. With these great boss mechanics, fantastic reward multipliers, and serviceable voice acting, with some sore spots here and there, looking at you, Twin Blades. My biggest critique of Manastorm overall is that I don't get enough of these amazing, unique levels. I fought the Twin Blades of Eternity maybe 4 times in about 450 levels of Manastorm, whereas I fought High Priest Jeklik and really any of the Gurubashi raid bosses well over 10 times for each of them. All these bosses have been designed well with some new Ascension-only mechanics, but I would still vastly prefer to see the original levels have an increase in the rate that they show up, because it's currently the freshest possible content to play in the Manastorm. I don't have a single complaint about any of the original levels, which is fantastic. I just wish I could play them more. Now for rolling changes, in general and general build progression, once again I think you guys absolutely knocked it right out of the park. Player agency that you have added to build making in Chapter 2 is crazy. The ability to card skill cards and talents at any level has fundamentally changed how people are looking at prestiging and build making overall. The community is still looking at what the true best and most optimal way to make a build actually is, and that has created a whole new avenue of content for people who actually really enjoy theory crafting. For the layman player, this change has resulted in completing builds in far fewer scrolls than what was previously true in Chapter 1. Synergy rolls feel great, and while they don't always hit their mark, I find that when you have a build just about set up, it practically completes itself in less than 300 rolls in my experience. After the rerolling changes were implemented, I was curious to see just how hard it was to make a functional build, so I loaded up a specialization that I've never used before, and attempted to roll a nature-based healer without any preparation and no prestiging, just rolling down from max level. At the end of my roll down session, where I spent about 100 ability scrolls and 300 talent scrolls, I have all of my mandatory talents, and I can hop in and play Mythic Plus, and although it might not be a perfected build, it's a serviceable build to tackle the content that I wanted to do as a healer. This is fantastic, as pretty much anyone who has been stockpiling scrolls from Chapter 1 has a nearly complete amount of freedom towards build making that they hadn't touched for any builds that they hadn't touched this season. For a brand new player, this also makes it so that the first build that you attempt to get off the ground happens far faster than originally. I have no complaints of the synergy roll or general roll changes that were introduced in Chapter 2. However, I do have some suggestions that may be hard to implement, but would increase the general enjoyability of making builds for the wider player base if possible, as I've seen a lot of people complain about this specific thing. If there was a system where you could ban 2 abilities and 2 talents from your build, so that when synergy rolls occur they do not land on them, I think that would do a lot for refining synergy rolls, making them feel really good for players who want to keep on top of that. Say, while making a pure Shadow Caster build, you end up landing on a rogue Shadow ability, something like Dark Intent, let's say, that you never intend to use, but you don't exactly have the scrolls to replace at the moment. With this system, you could ban that ability, and it will not steer you down the wrong road of rolling rogue-based synergies for your Warlock caster class. This is just a slight suggestion, and honestly, I'm not sure that it would ever be implemented, but I think it would help people feel a lot more agency over how their build shakes out, even if it doesn't actually impact the difficulty of the build process in the long term. Again, I think you're knocking it out of the park with these changes, and I have very few complaints overall. For the Mythic Plus changes, we had the release of higher difficulties as well as some general buffs to Mythic coin collection. Mythic Plus has had a pretty large boost in player population, and a lot of the less desirable dungeons had great loot multipliers applied to them to make the wider player base more accepting of these keys. This made it feel a lot less terrible to land on a Mythic Plus key that was generally viewed as unpopular. As before, it would make it incredibly hard to find groups to run it. Not only has the loot multiplier increases made it easier to find groups for traditionally less desirable dungeons, the implementation of the key rerolling system makes it even easier to find better keys for dungeons that even you can't stand. My only complaints for the Mythic Plus system currently is something that a lot of endgame players find themselves hitting a wall with. Mythic coin cap might seem good in theory to prevent you feeling like you can never stop running Mythic dungeons without falling behind. I actually find that it makes dedicated Ascension players feel like they have far too little options in terms of gearing, and that feels very bad. The crux of the issue is that you've capped out your Mythic coins, then you're fully at the mercy of the Mythic caches. This leads to a strange experience where early on in your Mythic Plus career, it feels really good because you can turn your coins into guaranteed gear drops and upgrade them, giving you a lot of agency over the pieces of equipment that you obtain. It feels very deterministic and satisfying. This makes it feel less grating on players when a Mythic Plus cache that you open contains no gear that you actually find usable. This combines with the fact that gear diversity is at an all-time low in Season 9, and I think this remains as one of the only sore spots of Season 9's gameplay loop. The bottom line is that there's not enough gear that feels good to use for the current Mythic coin limit to feel fair. You can hit a point in your Mythic coin expenditure when you've collected enough gear to comfortably build maybe 1 or 2 specializations. Now, of course, this all depends on your luck, but it can cause a long-term Mythic Plus player to feel as if they're stuck in a hamster wheel grind, where the individual dungeon no longer feels meaningful, which can lead to the grind ultimately feeling pointless or unenjoyable, which eventually diminishes the Mythic Plus environment population. Ultimately, I believe that this is a good thing in an MMO for there to be a point where you sit back and say, okay, I've done enough, and I can go touch some grass. I just believe that the current Mythic coin limit is too low for what is needed in the season. Otherwise, a lot of people who hit their limit feel that they are forced to play the Manastorm. And while the Manastorm is fantastic, and I love it when you want to play it, any method of gameplay that you feel forced into will usually have players harbor bitter feelings for them. My short and quick solution would be to increase the Mythic coin cap by about 50%, so you have longer until you hit this wall as a Mythic Plus player, but a more intricate solution might be necessary long term, but I don't really have ideas for that at the moment. The new abilities and playstyles that were introduced in Chapter 2 release seem really interesting, but at the moment it doesn't appear that there's enough support for the playstyles to really come to life. I haven't done extensive testing on the new abilities myself, however I do enjoy the thematic of the Spirit Wolf build quite a bit. The Ninja build is pretty cool too. It just seems that currently there aren't enough effects in the game that can cause them to be a competitive build in any form of content. I'm not an experienced theory crafter, at least in this point of my Ascension journey, so I'm mainly parroting the opinions of those who played around the new abilities, so I do hope that they get number buffs and perhaps a few more effects that allow them to really perform well. I think both the Ninja playstyle and the Feral Spirits playstyle is currently lacking a solid way to deal large amounts of area of effect damage, and maybe looking at ways to increase that could be a very positive way to push these builds further. They also might just need general scaling and damage improvement help, as I've seen in some discussions, specifically for the Ninja build, that the scaling on things like Shuriken Throw just seem to be very clunky and generally low. Overall, I believe that DPS and healer build variety is at an exceptional point as of Chapter 2 while I'm recording this. However, I find that tank diversity is seemingly at an all-time low, either because Crimson Champion is too potent of a build or the other tanks struggle too much in either satisfaction in terms of their gameplay or DPS factor, making them slightly less enjoyable to play comparatively. However, I would like to stress that rather than Crimson Champion receiving nerfs, I'd rather other tank variations receive slight number buffs here and there to push them as a more competitive and viable tank. That's just my 2 cents. I'm not a professional tank player, but it is the role that I have mained most over my career in Ascension, and to me it feels a shame that so many of the builds are stagnant for the tank player base. So, those are my thoughts on Chapter 2 so far. I've actually been playing far more than I ever was before Chapter 2 came out, and it's been really reinvigorating and encouraging to see so many foundational changes made to the game systems in Ascension. There was a rocky launch of Chapter 2 with the pervasive server lag on the first week that made the gameplay experience quite unenjoyable, but things like that happen all the time in game development. Unfortunately, it's not always easy to test how things like this perform when under the pressure of an intense population spike. But with those issues resolved, we're left with the absolute gems that these foundational changes turned out to be. I can't wait to see what the developers at Ascension cook up for Chapter 3, and for more changes to come during the Chapter 2 as they listen to the community feedback. Honestly, I cannot name another developer that takes its community feedback as seriously as Ascension does, and I think that's exactly what keeps this game alive. I can't wait to see more, and until then, I'm going to keep pumping out videos for you guys. If you did enjoy my thoughts on Chapter 2, then be sure to like and subscribe, as each one of those does help my channel immensely. I'm also very interested in hearing your thoughts on Chapter 2, so anyone who comments down below on the changes that came with this release will have a chance of winning a Celestial Observer's Adventurer Pack. Now this is actually the biggest giveaway that I've done yet, so I'm going to let a lot of comments flood in, as this is a big winner for anyone who actually lands this. I'm going to be giving it to one person. So other than that, I'll see you guys in the next video, and have a great day.